The Wisdom of Gor. 2. Knowing right from wrong. Might makes right. Proverb. Vae victis. Latin battle cry. Do you know, Tarnsman, he asked, that there is no justice without the sword? He smiled down on me grimly. This is a terrible truth, he said, and so consider it carefully. He paused. Without this, he said, touching the blade, there is nothing. No justice, no civilization, no society, no community, no peace. Without the sword, there is nothing. Marlanus to Tarl Cabot, Tarnsman of Gor. Anyone who honestly believes that the pen is mightier than the sword has never visited modern China, Saudi Arabia, or lately the social media of Western society. We have a faith that society's rules and restrictions are moral and based in truth. Yet every society upon the planet is maintained by force. There is not a single government nor culture that is not upheld by the scepter and those willing to wield it as a mace. Further, the majority of major conflicts between the nations has been by force. The 2 world wars we suffered in the 20th century have permanently shaped not only Western society, but that of the world. Without the Napoleonic Code being spread by the bayonets of the Grand Army, much of Europe would still be living under feudal restrictions. Christianity and Islam did not become world powers by peaceful evangelism, but rather by Roman gladii and Bedouin sword points. Alexander's Hellenization of the world was done at spear point, and the Romance languages are not called that because the people that inherited them are the descendants of allies, but rather that of conquered nations. The world of Gor has no concept of pacifism. It is a world that postulates that force, particularly violence, is an inescapable factor in life. Later in the exchange between Tarl and Marlanus, the deposed tyrant later states, right itself, that right of which you speak so reverently, owes its very existence to the sword. I think that is false, I said. I hope that is false. Tarnsman of Gor. It is an uncomfortable truth that the laws and customs of Gor are largely enforced by violence, and that in our real world, it is much the same. What prevents a man from committing theft? Obviously, appeals to his better nature work with only the very few that were already ethical. Threats of eternal damnation only work against those who were religious, and the disappointment of peers or threats of shaming only work on those against whom other people are seen as more than a means to the end. No. What prevents most people from committing a crime is the threat of force, the threat of punishment. And we allow the state this monopoly on violence from the belief that it is more benign, or at least more accountable for its use of violence and force, and hopefully less likely to invoke it, than the individuals that compose the state's population. It is a pleasant fiction, but fiction nonetheless. But leaving aside the realm of civil life, how are we supposed to know if something is right or wrong in and of itself? Is such a thing possible, or are all judgments of worth of something tied to its relation to other things? Most people, particularly detractors, assume that Gor advances the ends justify the means argument on the use of force, as well as whether or not something is or is not ethical. It would appear that all judgments of the moral worth of a thing or action are based upon its final outcome, to the Gorian mind. Murder could be justified if the victim of the murder would do more harm if left alive, or, even as more Gorians are depicted of as thinking, should the victim be opposed to the aims of the murderer. Theft can be condoned to the Gorian mind if the person who would be robbed is opposed to the hero of the tale. Now, while this appears to be the operating morality upon Gor, that's only a surface understanding. The qualifications to the Gorian mind on whether or not something is right or wrong are far more complicated, and though the decision must be upheld with force, usually force of arms, the ultimate qualification to the Gorian mind of whether or not something is right or wrong is closer to a system commonly called virtue ethics. The Gorian ethic actually agrees with the following sentiment. The doctrine that might makes right has covered the earth with misery. While it crushes the weak, it also destroys the strong. Every deceit, every cruelty, every wrong reaches back sooner or later and crushes its author. Justice is moral health, bringing happiness. Wrong is moral disease, bringing mortal death. John Peter Outgeld. Now I know what you're thinking. How can that be? Well, consider the examples we see of people that have done wrong just in Tarnsman, and what happens to them. Pakur comes to mind, who disobeys his case codes and tries to become a tyrant. He ends up dead. In Tarnsman, read of Tarl being about to be impaled by Marlenus, and Marlenus says to him, "But," went on Marlenus, "if what you say is true, how shall we separate the right dreams from the wrong dreams?" It seemed to me, Tarl, a difficult question. "Well, I'll tell you," laughed Marlenus. He slapped the blade fondly. "With this." Tarnsman of Gor. This is a dark revelation. It's the mirror image of the biblical. "Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down, and cast into the fire. Wherefore by their fruits ye shall know them." Book of Matthew, chapter 7, 17-20. Marlenus is essentially saying, hey, if I win, that's all that matters. It would seem to be the ends justify the means argument upon its surface. Yet the reason why Marlenus is defaulting to force and winning battles as his moral authority is because he has lost the exchange on philosophical grounds against Tarl. At one point the character even says, "I believe I have lost the exchange." And Marlenus is essentially admitting it with his actions. Marlenus' argument is that one can do wrong so long as one has the power to keep the consequences of that wrong at bay. Remember that Marlenus has broken Gor's customs on an Ubar returning his temporary tyrannical powers to the city which appointed him after the emergency is over, and had set himself up as a permanent tyrant. Marlenus is an advocate of the ends justify the means because he has no recourse but to stand on it, and this is a morally and ethically inferior argument, as the text will show. Having broken the law, what is right, he can no longer use the law as a moral guide, or claim to be ethical. This attitude that might makes right, in the mouth of a criminal, is the evidence from the author that his intention is to show that might alone does not make right. Marlenus is blind to the hypocrisy he expresses, since his position is that those who win are right, and yet he is in hiding because he lost. And we see this same argument displayed for us, but not overtly stated, in the character of Pakur the assassin, who is attempting the very same action that got Marlenus exiled. Marlenus is an advocate of the end justifies the means, because he has no recourse to stand on anything other than this ethically inferior argument. And I believe that Norman's argument is actually that what makes something ethical is independent of who is endorsing it as being acceptable. Would we, for instance, believe that a thief, when they tell us that theft is noble? Would we trust a murderer who informs us that vengeance is more expedient and fair than waiting upon the fickle judgments of the justice system? I should hope your answer to both the preceding questions would be no. Why then should we, the reader, take leave of our reason and assume that the author intends for Marlenus' position to be the proper ethic of his fictional society? It clearly is not, otherwise Tarl's attempt to rectify wrongs would not be celebrated as the centerpiece of the story. Awareness of self is immortality, and false knowledge which causeth unawareness of the self is indeed real death. The Mahabharata. On my first day in that defining college philosophy course, the instructor said to us, when he was ending his class, "Opinion without knowledge is bullshit." The Gorian wisdom would not only agree, the Gorian ethic believes that knowledge is the basis of right and wrong. Wrong is a form of ignorance and willful neglect. Right is a maintaining or restoring of what is known to be true and good. Throughout most of Tarnsman of Gor, and the novel that follows, Outlaw of Gor, Tarl is acting out of a set of enculturated values from Earth that are in conflict with the values of Gor. His dilemma in these first two novels is the tension between the two moralities and attempting to reconcile them. Hence here in Tarnsman, and the argument with Marlenus, he has no answer to Marlenus' question of how shall we be able to tell right from wrong. But Tarl discovers the answer by deeds during the events of Tarnsman of Gor. Tarl notices that those he is opposed to during the novel are possessed of faults, whereas he and those that are striving to restore order are possessed of virtues. Virtue ethics is currently one of the three major approaches in normative ethics, It may initially be identified as one of the emphases and virtues or moral character in contrast to the approach that emphasizes duties or rules, deontology, or that emphasizes the consequences of actions, consequentialism. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. From Charles' misgivings about deceiving the American school during his first conversation with his father, and during the conversation he has when at first thinking to free Telena and later his conversation with Marlenus, we see someone who's in conflict about doing wrong. Charles correctly concludes that to do wrong harms both the person wronged and the doer of the wrong, for it robs the perpetrator of the sense of being a true human being. The Gorian ethic, based on virtue and fulfilling one's caste obligations, is complete anathema to somehow damaging that image of yourself as fulfilling your role. The Gorian argument is that by encouraging men and women to live with virtue, most of society's ills will be alleviated, or at least greatly mitigated. And he said, "What comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All of these things come from within, and they defile a person." Book of Mark, chapter 7, 20-23. That there are men and women who will willfully fail in nurturing these virtues that Gor advocates is acknowledged. This would be the Gorian's definition of injustice. Failing to do one's duty out of inability or even benign ignorance would be classified as a mistake by most Gorians, but being unwilling to make restitution would be considered the fault by those same Gorians. Keep in mind that Marlenus and Parkour are both in violation of their caste codes, the obligations they swore to uphold, and they are the villains of Tarnsman of Gor. The same forsaking of vows will be the central motivation and outlaw of Gor, and its villains as well, and this fault is partially present in Assassin of Gor, the fourth novel. The question seems to follow then, what do Gorians consider to be virtuous? Every act should be done thoroughly. One should be always heedful, for such a minute thing as a thorn, if extracted badly, leads to obstinate gangrene. The Mahabharata. Yet, in spite of his incomparable eccentricities, his petulance and exasperation, I felt drawn to the man, and sensed something in him I admired, a shrewd and kind spirit and a love of learning, which can be one of the deepest and most honest of loves. A little bit further in the passage, he linked me, this moment, and himself to generations of men who had pondered on the world and its meaning. Charles Cabot, describing Torm the Scholar, Tarnsman of Gor. Note that in the above description of a character who is not the standard alpha male that detractors complain is the Gorian ideal, we see a bookish, academic, introverted, yet also intelligent, dedicated, and compassionate man. Gorians value strength in men, but they do not mean the physical ability to lift weight alone. They are speaking of the strength of character. Torm, as described above, proves to Tarl that he has this virtue. Gorians seem to judge whether or not someone is being virtuous by the following criteria. First and foremost, is the person fulfilling their obligations of caste? Second, is the person attempting to improve their mastery of their skills and caste function? Third, is the person harming others unduly? Fourth, is the person behaving as benefiting to their sex's virtues? Going back to Torm as an example, Torm is clearly fulfilling the obligations of his caste of being a scholar. His room is described as having only a few personal possessions, but it is stacked from floor to ceiling with books and scrolls. He is clearly trying to improve his mastery, and he complains, only somewhat in jest, that the time he is taking to teach Tarl the Gorian language is time wasted that he could be using to learn more of the scrolls in his room that he has yet unread. He is shown using his knowledge to aid his patrons and others rather than using it for selfish gain, and though he is not a warrior, he has strength of character to do what is necessary to attempt great deeds. This is one example of the Gorian ideal of virtue, and it is at odds with the gross oversimplification that comes from detractors of the series, citing that Gor is about men using nothing but force. It is not that the Gorian ethic is about excusing violence. It is that the Gorian ethic accepts that to bring about justice, violence may be necessary. Many detractors of this series despise a common saying amongst living Gorians, the community that tries to emulate Gor in real life. The saying goes something like this: men express strength and honor, women express love and beauty. By this it is assumed by detractors that men have a patriarchal right to have their will obeyed and women are but vehicles for men to be pleased by. While there is a strong element of eroticism and sexual submission in the Gor novels and in the living Gor community, the idea that men alone have worth and women have worth only as men give it to them is faulty of both. On Gor, both men and women have worth if they are being virtuous, and there is no other standard. A warrior may die in battle. He may not succeed, but so long as he has entered the fray, he is considered to be virtuous and has worth. A woman may become the slave of a new master on Gor, yet so long as she serves that new master faithfully, she is being virtuous and has worth. This is an older definition of worth and virtue, more akin to what in our real world would have been used during the Bronze Age, and that should not be surprising considering that Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato are influential upon the world of Gor by Norman's own admission. In both the above examples, the dying warrior and the serving woman, it is whether or not the person attempted to perform their duty that makes them virtuous. A warrior that runs from the battle or a woman that refuses to serve would both be considered to be at fault, and depending on the extent of the infraction, they might be considered to be doing a great wrong or even evil and be punished. Consider Tarl Cabot. Tarl is attempting to perform the duty for which he was brought to Gor in Tarnsman of Gor. He behaves according to his caste codes, and at many points in the journey it looks as if he might fail, yet at no point would he be considered to be at fault or committing evil according to the Gorian ethic. By this same logic, that Tarl is virtuous because he is attempting a deed, Marlenus becomes somewhat virtuous in the scene at the siege of Ar. Having led his troops into the city to relieve the siege and then being trapped, Marlenus is rescued by Tarl, and together they free the city. For his service, Marlenus is banished, but this is the lighter punishment since he could have been slain for his former infraction. The city is acknowledging Marlenus' virtue. On Gor, right and wrong are easy to know, even if they are not exactly the same thing as good and evil. Marlenus asks the question because he is morally corrupt at the time. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is a sin. The book of James, chapter 4, verse 17. Wrong does not cease to be a wrong because the majority share in it. Leo Tolstoy. Tolstoy's quote and Marlenus' question to Tarl confuse right and wrong with good and evil. This is a common mistake, as typically what is good is hardly ever wrong, and when it is, society rapidly changes to embrace the new understanding. That may have been a bit confusing, so let me repeat the concept from a former video of mine in another series. It is possible for something to be right, that is accepted by society, and still be evil. That is, it is undesirable and causes harm. It is possible for something to be good, that is, it promotes well-being and is desirable, yet also be wrong, that is, society does not accept it. In The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, as Huck struggles with this dilemma of should he do the right thing by turning in Jim the runaway slave, even though slavery and aiding slavery is evil, or should he do the wrong thing and lie to save Jim because it is considered good? We all know what Huck will answer, and in a way, it's very Gorian. Convinced he is facing eternal damnation of his soul if he turns Jim in, Huck tells us, the reader, "It was a close place. I took it up and held it in my hand. I was a-tremblin', because I'd got to decide forever betwixt two things, and I knowed it. I studied a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then says to myself, all right then, I'll go to hell. And I tore it up." The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, chapter 31. Huck is referring to a letter that will tell Jim's owner where he is. Though we cannot express it as succinctly as Huck, throughout Tarnsman of Gor, we witness Tarl Cabot acting on this inner conviction that something is or is not good or evil, and hang right or wrong. He does as much good as he can while restricted by Gor's caste cultural expectations. He tries to mitigate or avoid performing what he knows to be evil, while at the same time trying to make what he knows is restitution when he must do so, or greater evil will occur. This theme also runs through parts of the second, third, and fourth novels. He is hampered by the savage conditions on Gor, much as I imagine any civil rights activist has been in a society that has barbarous conventions, and his willingness to enforce them with violence. And yet, though things are not shown to change on the world of Gor solely by Tarl's efforts, we do see things improve slightly, even if only by degree, in the places that Tarl visits during the series. In Tarl, arguably our example of what Norman feels is proper male behavior, there is a dedication to doing what is good and right, at least so much as it was within his power. This is in direct odds with those that believe Norman is endorsing barbarity. At the end of Tarnsman of Gor, Tarl is exiled back to Earth by the Priest Kings, and he tells the reader the following. It is an example of how the character is instinctively tied to the earthborn concept of doing right and good. The text reads, "But if I am so summoned, they will do so with the understanding that I am resolved to be no pawn in their vast games. Who or what the Priest Kings are, that they should determine the lives of others, that they should rule a planet, terrorize the cities of the world, commit men to flame death, tear lovers from each other's arms. No matter how fearful their power, they must be challenged." Tarnsman of Gor, ending passage. People who do not believe in doing the right thing, the good thing, despite the costs, even if it means defying a god, those people are not heroes. Heroes do the right thing, the good thing, no matter the cost, even if it means defying the god. Norman's character is a rebuke to what he feels has become a modern man's reluctance to do the thing that is difficult, yet also good. It is that same criticism of modern man that Friedrich Nietzsche penned in Ecce Homo. And as Norman has said in interviews that Nietzsche's writing has influenced his thought, we should also not be surprised the concept shows up on Gor. That Norman too believes that men must be heroic, and that by their efforts they make meaning for their fellow men, should also not surprise us, and is part of how Norman would have you judge good and evil and right and wrong. In this quote, Nietzsche uses the word good, but in my opinion it is more appropriate to replace it with right or proper, as right and proper are social conventions. I have placed proper into the quote for this very purpose, where Nietzsche is quoted as using the word good. Zarathustra, the first to recognize that the optimist is just as degenerate as the pessimist, though perhaps more detrimental, says, let me repeat that. Zarathustra, the first to recognize that the optimist is just as degenerate as the pessimist, though perhaps more detrimental, says, "Proper men never speak the truth. The proper preach of false shores and false security. You were born and bred in the lies of the proper. Through the proper, everything has become false and twisted down to the very roots. Fortunately, the world is not built solely to serve the properly natured herd animals and their little happiness. To desire everybody to be the proper man, a herd animal, blue-eyed, benevolent, a beautiful soul, or as Herbert Spencer wished, altruistic, would mean robbing existence of its great character. To castrate mankind and reduce humanity to a sort of wretched Chinadom, and this some have tried to do, is precisely this that men have called morality." On Gor, good and evil, right and wrong, are known by examining one's strength of character. They are known by virtue.